would like to welcome you to the panel called The Business Case for ESG. Lessons learned from 2020. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers for being here. First of all, I would like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Our first speaker is Feroz Nadar. He is Executive Director at United Nations, Global Compact, Malaysia and Brunei. Feroz, please.
Thank you, Kubra. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts today. So here today I'm representing the UN Global Compact Network Malaysia, which is the local network for the United Nations Global Compact, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability movement, over 13,000 private sector members. So primarily what we do is that we work with private sector to make them more ambitious about achieving the SDGs and to accelerate their transition towards a sustainable future. That's what we do.
Okay. Our next speaker is Rajesh Shabara. He's Managing Director at CSR Works International. Rajesh, please.
Thank you, Kubra, and greetings from Singapore. I want to thank the Turkish IR Society for inviting me to speak at this super fantastic event. And a special thank you to Asli and Kubra for the invitation. I am the founder and managing director of CSR Works International in Singapore. CSR Works is the oldest sustainability services firm in the region, and we are focused on consulting, training, and thought leadership. Our key partners include GRI, the IIRC, the SASB, CDP, EcoVadis, Accountability, S&P Global. So we work with all the alphabets that you know and make a curry out of it. Our thought leadership has three very exciting programs: Asia Sustainability Reporting Awards, Asia Sustainability Reporting Summit, and Asia's Top Sustainability Superwomen. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate the two Turkish companies for winning the 6th Asia Sustainability Reporting Awards we hosted last month. Industrial Development Bank of Turkey on winning the bronze medal for Asia's Best Integrated Report, and Kordsa Teknik Texel for winning the silver medal for Asia's Best Materiality Reporting. I'm truly privileged to be here on this panel, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
That's great to hear that there were two companies who actually won in the competition as well. So our next speaker is Richard Betts. He's Sustainability Director at KPMG. Richard.
Thanks, Kubra, and hello, everyone. So, first of all, yes, a big thank you to TÜYID, to the Turkish Investor Society, for inviting me. And that's right. As Kubra said, I'm currently Director of Sustainability Services for KPMG in Istanbul. I've been with the Big Four for about 15 years now, focused on sustainability, and I lead our sustainability services here in Turkey, but also very heavily involved with our global work around sustainability as well.
Great. Our next speaker is Tiffany Grabsky. She's Senior Specialist at United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges.
Great, thanks. First, I'd like to thank you, Kubra, for coordinating this panel discussion today, and especially to the Turkish Investor Relations Society for putting this important event together. I was very pleased to be asked by Kubra to participate today to bring a slightly different perspective from that of my three esteemed colleagues joining us today on this panel. In addition to being an academic, I'm currently working on my doctoral dissertation at the University of Geneva, where I study stock exchanges as levers for change. I also work, as Kubra mentioned, at the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative. And while many people, when they think of stock exchanges, will conjure images of flashing lights and rapidly changing numbers and often shouting men, not often women, stock exchanges have become much more than a meeting place for buying and selling. In particular, stock exchanges have a very important role in educating, training, and preparing their markets for changes in regulation, investor demand, and in trends. So I'm very pleased to be here today to bring a little bit of a different insight on how markets can be a source for positive impact. And I'm looking forward to this interesting discussion today with Kubra, Feroz, Rajesh, and Richard. Thanks.
Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, I would like to start off the discussion today with the concept of purpose. COVID has been a wake-up call for many of us. It has exposed our vulnerabilities. It has triggered also a desire for change. The interplay between various global organizations, governments, and the private sector is generating a new wave of purposeful companies. In light of lessons learned from 2020, how is purpose becoming a new measure of success? And are you seeing an increased cooperation between various global organizations since COVID? Feroz, could you please share your views?
Thank you, Kubra. At the start of the pandemic, about a year plus now, the word new normal has been thrown out very often, right? Now we are 1.5 years into the pandemic, and I think we have not come to an agreed definition of what is the new normal. We're still figuring out. But perhaps for me, I'd like to ask: are we really in a new normal? I definitely would agree that it's new habits, but is it really a new normal? Because what is being brought up from the pandemic situation is that from a business perspective is that there is still a lot of inequalities in play from a accessibility to social agendas like vaccines. So there's a lot of inequality from developed countries and developing economies access. So it kind of highlighted that, the normal is just brought up more in the pandemic. And from a business perspective, unfortunately, is that businesses are still fixated at looking at shareholder value versus stakeholder value, right? And you see, if you read the reports that's coming out, the billionaires are actually adding wealth, while you see the the M40s and the B40s are struggling to maintain the pre-COVID quality of life. And I think this boils down to the fact that this purpose versus function for businesses, right? I'm under no illusions that a business needs to profit, yes, but it is a function of the business. The purpose for the business would then to yield the influence and the profit that it gets to is positive impact making actions. I think that's where the purpose kicks in. So until and when we can demarcate the difference between the function and purpose, this will be a recurring questions for many of businesses. Now, I just want to allude to an example in Malaysia. So there is an ironic example that one of the hottest stocks last year was a glove maker, right? I mean, they grew exponentially, perhaps could rival crypto in terms of growth. But ironically, the reason why they grew so much was because of COVID, but also because of a COVID cluster. It unearthed certain human rights issues in their supply chains and how they're treating the migrant workers, and that put a break for some of their business agenda, and they were banned from exporting to certain countries. Now, yes, they have taken a lot of remedial strides, but certain bans are still in place, which comes to the question is that did they do it for a function to unbar sales for more profit, or did they do it because their purpose was to now create a more inclusive, more prosperous business for all their stakeholders, including these migrant workers that they employ? So I think those are some of the considerations that we've got to see and some of the lessons learned that we in COVID. And for me, unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that it is not yet a photo finish between purpose-driven businesses and function-driven businesses in this COVID world. It's still very much, at the end of the day, is I've got to take care of shareholder value at the expense of stakeholders. And until that transition happens, it's going to be status quo, and it's just a more, highlighted normal rather than a new normal. But I think there is a lot of hope in the near future, because with my conversation with many of the young executives, they carry a very different tone on what a business should do and how it should contribute, right? So take, for example, I was speaking to a young bank executive, and I was saying that, sustainability needs to bring business sense, right? And he corrected me, he said, no, I believe that sustainability will benefit business, right? So I was very heartened and said, oh, I know this the next generations see the reality, feel it, and I think they will have the stomach and the drive and the will to make the transition that at the end of the day, it may result in some short pain for the shareholders, but a longer term gain for all stakeholders. And I think that's where that purpose needs to come in from a business perspective. Thank you, Cobra.
That is very interesting, especially the example that you have highlighted. Actually, one company that is really supposed to help us and keep us safe by producing gloves and exporting it all over the world during COVID actually has some human rights issues. So that was an excellent example, actually. Thank you so much. Rajesh, could we please hear your views?
Sure, I completely agree with what Feroz just said. The reality is that the world has not emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic yet. The pandemic has left communities and economies bruised and battered. Already 3.6 million people have died. More than 170 million people are still infected. Many more are likely to be infected and die in the coming months. Repeated and painful lockdowns have shuttered millions of businesses. Millions have lost their jobs and livelihoods. In the middle of such death and devastation, thinking positive is the only hope many have. Yet, being positive has become the most dreaded word. Sooner than later, we need to rebuild. We need to build back, build stronger, and build better. We also have to ensure that this kind of pandemic never happens again, not in our lifetime, and not in the lifetimes of our future generations. The question is, how do we do that? Where do we start? Where do we go from here? And how long we have? To get these answers, we have to examine how we have landed in this catastrophe in the first place. What went wrong? Why, despite all the scientific progress and enormous technological advancement, that was only fiction for our ancestors, we are in such despair and gloom, rendered helpless by a virus we cannot see. We are where we are today because businesses have relied on a deeply flawed theory of profit maximization. In 1954, the father of modern management, Peter Drucker, argued that there is only one valid purpose of a corporation: to create a customer. And then a few decades later, in 1970, economist Milton Friedman argued that the sole purpose of a business is to generate profits for its shareholders. For decades, business schools have taught their students that maximizing share profit is everything. In 2009, Jack Welch called it the dumbest idea in the world, finally. So, what made companies follow the dumbest idea for so long? The answer is one word: greed. And greed led to another mechanism for profit maximization: risk. It became acceptable to take higher risk for higher profit. Such a distorted sense of purpose has led us to crisis. First credit, now COVID, and the next is climate. Before we rebuild, companies need to rethink their purpose. Businesses need to see themselves as a part of society, not apart from society. There will be no customer and no profit if there is no planet and there are no communities. There is an urgent need for companies to repurpose their business for their own good and for the good of all. A key lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And the only way we can achieve this is to join hands and do it together. The UN Sustainable Development Goals provide a practical roadmap for companies to repurpose and rebuild a resilient future. Actually, the SDGs are the vaccine that we need to build an immune future. So that's where I will stop, Kubra, and listen to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rajesh, for this really nice clarifications as well. Richard, can we please hear your views?
Sure, yes. So thanks, Kubra. And well, I completely agree with the great comments just made by the other panelists. So I completely echo those thoughts. I mean, I think, yeah, and I'll just sort of pick up on a few of the comments that Rajesh just made then. I mean, I think, firstly, we can see many parallels between our collective experience with COVID and what we need to do when facing other key issues that we're now facing, such as climate. As Rajesh said, you know, we're facing a virus. We've been facing a virus that we can't see. And when we come to climate change, we're also facing this global systemic challenge, just like COVID is a systemic risk. We're facing a global systemic risk that we also cannot really see, because climate change manifests itself differently in different parts of the world. In some places, the key issues is in terms of record wildfires. In another area, it's drought. In another area, it's sea level rise, etc., etc., etc. So, I think we haven't been joining the dots together very well, and so that's partly impeded our ability to respond to a threat such as climate change or such as COVID. But maybe then, before going into the how question as to how sort of purpose is now starting to be an important parameter for many companies, I think first, yeah, we have that why point. So we've kind of been connecting it with COVID and with the science, and that's a key point, that we need to follow the science. You know, we are blessed with all these sort of huge breakthroughs, all this sort of unprecedented knowledge at our disposal now. We really need to sort of you know, follow the scientific guidance, and the science is clear that many of the top risks now facing business, now facing humanity, facing all of us, are systemic risks such as connected to climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemic risks, and that these are not only systemic risks, but they're heavily interconnected. You know, at the end of the day, we do live in a highly interconnected planetary system and a global economy, and so, you know, we're now facing several unprecedented global crises, such as the climate crisis, which has been described as the greatest risk to ever face humanity. So I think, you know, given this backdrop of what our experts are telling us are the top issues facing us all, you know, for businesses to maintain their success, they need to be sustainable, purposeful companies, and that all of us as companies and as individuals, we all have a responsibility to contribute to the solutions, and to have a purpose, because, you know, none of us can afford to operate in a vacuum, oblivious to all these great challenges that we're now faced with. So I think that's, you know, that's the context. We're starting to see more of a focus then on purpose and on impact. This brings many business benefits as well, in terms of it can help companies manage their risks and manage their exposure to what are now the top risks facing business, but also to strengthen their customer loyalty, to improve their the performance of employees and sort of enhancing employee motivation, reducing turnover, people feeling that they're working in a purposeful organization, a company that has clear purposes aligned with societal goals, and many other benefits as well, helping companies to develop new products and services. So I think we all have a responsibility then to contribute wherever we can to the solutions. There are many benefits connected to that, and as KPMG, what we've done over the last year is so last summer and in the middle of the global pandemic, we launched our new global strategy. It's called Impact, and it's all focused on how we can achieve purposeful growth for our organization and for our clients, and focused on the key issues facing our clients, facing our business, facing all of us, such as climate change, in terms of how can we maximize our impact in contributing to climate solutions. So we've recently started new working groups around carbon removal solutions, looking at the potential of new technologies, big focus on decarbonisation and on climate risk. And this is, we're still in the first year with this, but this has really sort of helped focus minds, both with internal and external stakeholders, showing that our role should not be just about maximizing those short-term financial returns, but we should also be looking at how we can contribute positively and maximize our performance in these other key areas that we're facing.
Thank you very much, Richard. And also, I appreciate that you provided us an example from KPMG as well. So that was very interesting to hear. Tiffany, we would love to hear your views as well.
Great, thanks, Kubra. And thanks to the other panelists for setting a really good business case for why we need to be balancing now both the profit and the purpose, or perhaps pushing purpose ahead of profit even. And Richard, for that great example of how KPMG is trying to tackle this. I think it's important that we're sharing how we are moving forward, whether we know if it's the best way forward or not. We're all in this together. I think you've all really touched well on this area of profit and purpose. So I'm only going to add one thing to it that I thought of when Feroz was talking about this more kind of holistic view. And I'm actually stealing this from someone else, thanks to the Zoom world we live in now. I was recently at a conference where Jeffrey Sachs was speaking, and he said something I think is particularly relevant for our conversation today, and that's that we need to reimagine what Adam Smith published in 1776 as the wealth of nations, which I think we're still working on now, and start to think of a mindset of the well-being of nations. And it's important to note that wealth is certainly part of the well-being. But rather than changing the measurements and changing the way we're operating, we need to think more expansively and more holistically in the way we profit and the way we see the world around us. But since everyone else has given such great examples of that aspect of the question of how we need to integrate purpose and profit in both our public policy making as well as our corporate policies and practices, I think I'd really like to touch on the other aspect of the question, which is cooperation. We've used so many different terms for these challenges that we're facing right now. And I'm talking not just about the pandemic, but as the others have also touched on, the climate crisis and inequality, et cetera. And we, in the academic world, refer to them as grand challenges or wicked problems. In policy world, we call them global issues. But what's consistent is that they see no borders. And as our world really tried to shut its borders to prevent the spread of COVID in 2019 and 2020, I think we really realized that without collaboration among nations, among political parties, among organizations, challenges of these grand scales and magnitude they just can't be tackled. So at the SSE, we've always highlighted partnerships as one of our key factors, and collaboration has been a part of everything we do. The initiative itself is a partnership between the United Nations through 3 UN agencies. That's UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, the UNEP-FI, which is the UN Environment Program's Finance Initiative, and of course the UN Global Compact, who we have with us here today as well. And then we work as well with the Principles of Responsible Investment, PRI, which is a UN-backed NGO. But really, from my opinion, the SSE started as a private sector initiative. While the SSE initiative existed as an annual meeting since 2009, it was really founded by 5 partner exchanges, which Borsa Istanbul is one of them. And that's what launched the SSE in 2012 as a partnership initiative. These 5 founding stock exchanges committed to integrating sustainability into their mainstream markets. And since then, we've now grown to more than 100 partner members, which are 100 stock exchanges around the world that have voluntarily signed a commitment to work on sustainability in their markets. So this includes all mainstream markets across the globe. And soon we'll also be welcoming derivative exchanges as well. And so while stock exchanges are certainly our key constituents, it's important to note that in all of our work, we can't do anything if we don't include all stakeholders. So in all of our policy recommendations and all of our guidance documents for the private sector, we always include policymakers, regulators, investors, issuers, and civil society. And I do find that more and more when we work with stock exchanges, we find that they're already working with a variety of partners, helping to ensure a more holistic approach to the many aspects of sustainability that they engage their markets on. So just to wrap that up, I certainly think that consciousness of the need to work together and to tackle these global and, as Richard pointed out, systemic challenges is certainly growing. But I think that's because there's a growing recognition of the responsibility and the need to act or to be left behind.
Tiffany, that's great. First of all, it was great to hear an example of cooperation from United Nations, because that's definitely one organizations where we can learn about cooperation. And also it was good to hear that Borsa Istanbul was one of the first founding exchanges of sustainable stock exchanges. So that's good to hear too. Okay, so my next question will be on SDGs. And the SDGs are the goals that the world has accepted as being global priorities through 2030. And COVID is heavily connected with many of these. At the same time, I believe that we should not be looking at various sustainability issues in isolation. We should try to understand the connections between them. For instance, when corporations select their SDGs based on their impact, should they maybe take also a second step? And should they look at how they can create value across the SDGs as well? In order to start off this discussion, I will provide a brief example. Clearly, climate change and inequalities are highly connected to each other. As an example, some of the most vulnerable people in the world, they live in the tropics. In the future, if we don't take care of climate change, if temperatures rise to much higher levels, then some of those areas may no longer be even habitable. This means those people who are already vulnerable living in the tropics may have to leave their homes. This may cause mass migration. And that would not only worsen already existing inequalities, but it could also have an impact on peace. So I could already tie 3 SDGs there to each other and try to show how they are connected to each other. Now, from our speakers, may I ask, what are your views on how you perceive SDGs could be connected to each other? Feroz, could we start with you, please?
Sure. the good thing about SDGs is that, you know, everything is interrelated to each other, and also I suppose that's also the challenge as well, right? But we although it's at the 17 level, I think everything is nicely connected, but we also must keep in mind that there is 169 indicators and 260 targets, which is quite disparate across the lot. But I agree with you that many actions that we take will also impact across board. So SDGs need to be anchored around a systems thinking approach, right? So I'm going to share an example which I recently found out from a Malaysian perspective. So I was speaking to a newly launched private sector initiative around circular economy here, and we were discussing about some collaborations, and they were sharing that, you know, in Malaysia there's a few states that actually has a waste segregation act, and I was like, okay, I did not know this as a citizen, right? And she said, yeah, most people don't know this, right? So when you talk about the SDGs of sustainable cities and communities, I think the underlying here is communities. If the community themselves don't know what they can contribute at the individual level, you're not able to achieve the other SDGs, right? The other flip side is also true if you talk about decent work. Now, if the community is always stressed about, you know, the Maslow's basic living, you can't go and tell him, yeah, you know, go and invest in expensive solar panels. It just doesn't work. So there's this realities that needs to be deployed, and I think this is where the opportunities for businesses also kick in, right? The innovation shouldn't be just about you know, minimizing my work and maximizing my profit. I think you've got to be innovative about how do you spread the potential to earn across board, right? So for example, right, in Malaysia, you've got the net energy metering, right, where an individual household can install solar panel, you sell it back to the grid. You know, you make quite a substantial upfront investment, but you recoup it in 8 to 9 years, and then you have purchase agreement for 20 years. So basically 13 years, you kind of profit on this. But as an individual, I've got to out-pocket a significant amount of money. And you see the uptake is very low because I got to take out my money first. Now, the solar panel providing companies perhaps could think of a different way. Say, okay, tell you what, I will do it for you for free. I'll give you a little money to rent it, and you can perhaps scale it up, right? But the risk now doesn't reside in individual, but it's taken by the business. So I think that's how the interrelatedness can happen between the various SDG functions. Thank you, Kubra. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this example, Feroz. Rajesh, would you like to continue, please?
Yes, Kubra, thank you. So, you know, as it's well understood that all the 17 goals, they are actually interconnected. And if you look at the 17 goals, I can say that to simplify that some of them, they relate to the planet, and the rest relate to people who live in that planet. So, you know, planet and societies, they are not separate from each other. I could connect all 17, as you know, Richard also said that, and Feroz said, we know that if we can connect all 17. But when it comes for businesses, you know, the practices that because of an established practice of focusing on impact, they will start with impact, and then they will see where are, like what the way we work with our clients, we say that look at these goals and then look at how your business has an influence, whether it's positive or negative contribution to these 17 goals. So that's how the entire process begins. And once you start that process, then they find that they already have some positive contribution to some of these goals by way of the way they do their business, and then they have some negative contributions. And then they follow through that process, then they identify, prioritize a few SDGs where they think that they can make the maximum contribution. And then we take them to the next step by saying that, okay, so risks and opportunities are very well understood. So let's look at, the positive and negative contribution is well understood. Let's look at opportunities now. So where are the opportunities from the SDGs in terms of products and services that the society is going to need? So we all know that there are a couple of trillions of dollars needed every year if we have to achieve these goals by 2030. Now, you can't move a couple of $1 trillion every year without financial institutions being in the picture. And what will you do with $2 trillion? They will be spent to where? So as Feroz was giving a good example. So then, there's a whole lot of industry which is going to benefit. So that's the business side. But then we also explain to the business that even though you have decided to focus on these 4, 5, or 6, because many businesses are reluctant to say that we support all 17 goals. And sometimes that's not really viewed favorably. So they would want to prioritize, because businesses are about focusing where the value is instead of trying to do everything. But then we explain to them that one action of yours can actually contribute to many other SDGs. So I have something here in my hand to show you as an example. So, for example, I start with, this. I don't know whether you can see this or not, maybe not.
Okay, can you more to the middle? Yeah, right now we can see it.
Right. So this is number 8. So decent work and economic growth. Now, this is something which is very relevant for a business. And we say that if you focus on this, and if you identify from the risk and where you make a positive contribution and opportunities point of view, and then you start taking action, some of the other things that will happen is this, right? So you will pay attention to this. So you are managing your waste. You are going for making more thoughtful decisions about the resources that you're going to use. And once you start doing that and focus on decent work and economic growth, then you also perhaps will need to do this, because then you will have to focus on innovation and invest in infrastructure for many of them. The moment you do this, and even if you just focus on decent work, you see what happens, depending on where you are. Because, for example, just now there is a new initiative, which is Sustainable Trade Initiative. It's a newly launched initiative this year. And a lot of multinational companies, they have made a commitment to make sure that their suppliers pay living wage to their employees by 2030. And Unilever and L'Oreal and a few other companies, they have made that commitment. So if their suppliers start paying living wage, you see here, you are addressing poverty. Once you address poverty, there's a no-brainer that you are going to address zero hunger. And once you do that, then the next in line is that you are reducing inequalities. And once that is happening, and people have better income, better jobs, decent jobs, good employers, so perhaps they are better prepared to take care of their health and their well-being. And then that's how then we can look at the goal of the sustainable cities and communities. And the one that I love, the last one, is we can't do this alone. Nobody can do this alone. And that's where Tiffany was mentioning about collaboration and partnership. And for me, that's the most important one. And that's where then you start looking at, and this is goal 17 is the one which brings everyone together, really shows the connectivity and really shows that how you can do it together. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's was very insightful. We really appreciate it. Okay, Richard, would you like to continue, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kubra. And first, I'd like to sort of add a couple of comments to what Rajesh said, and also actually then to a comment to what you said, Kubra. So I think firstly, in terms of the SDGs, so as we've been saying, yes, they're heavily interconnected, but I think that so okay, we see a lot of companies that are starting to address the SDGs, but overall, there's a great deal more that can be done. because in many cases it's so far it's been approached as like a reporting disclosure exercise. So a company will work on developing their sustainability report, let's say, and then at the end, or as part of that process, they'll consider what the connections are to SDGs, and then it'll be done as like a mapping exercise between their pre-existing initiatives and SDGs to show the contributions to what to what they've done, and that's that's okay, but that's quite reactive, and I think we're missing a lot of the strategic value from the Sustainable Development Goals, whereby what we could be doing and what we should be doing is sort of integrating those into sort of the initial planning phase to think about, well, okay, so how can we integrate the SDGs into our strategy, into our sort of planning, so that before we start new initiatives, we consider the SDGs, we consider how we can sort of maximize our impact across SDGs at the beginning, rather than what often happens, going through sort of the normal business processes and then at the end of it considering what SDG. So I think there's a great deal that could be done to make it more strategic. A lot of untapped potential with the SDGs on that side. As Rajesh also said, his last comment was in terms of the importance of collaboration, which was also a key comment from Tiffany. And I think this is a point to emphasize, because when we're faced with these sort of huge systemic global issues of unprecedented scale and complexity, like climate change, often people's sort of default reaction can be, or companies' default reaction can be, well, what can they do? It won't have any impact. It won't matter because they're only one person in a planet of, pushing 8 billion people, or they're only one company, etc., etc., etc. But I think if we turn it around if we flip it around and say, well, if we think of how we got into this situation in terms of climate change or these other systemic issues, we don't see one sole cause. We see many sort of factors that have contributed to global warming, and so how cumulatively they've given us these global issues of unprecedented complexity and severity, and so really that shows us just how actually what we do or do not do in these from now on can actually have a very big impact. So those are just sort of a couple of follow-on comments. And then Kubra, you gave the example of gender, sort of linking social gender issues with climate change, and yes, many interconnections, and I think many untapped, a lot of untapped potential there, because again we tend to think of these things in isolation. Climate change tends to get is often buried sort of within the E of ESG when it's a systemic issue, and so climate change, as well as being an environmental issue, is also our most pressing social issue. And I think we've tended to sort of overlook these kind of points. So by tackling and create very significant co-benefits, such as in terms of helping us to tackle climate change. Indeed, the very influential Project Drawdown report highlighted tackling gender inequality, especially in developing economies, as one of the most significant things we could do to help tackle climate change. And obviously, primarily we should be doing it to improve the lives of women and young girls in developing economies. But it's clear there will be very significant co-benefits And we've by focusing on things in isolation, be it climate change, be it gender, be it biodiversity, which is the example I actually wanted to give, we've been missing these sort of these very significant sort of intersections. And so there's really enormous untapped potential by taking the systemic view, not focusing on things in isolation, but thinking, well, okay, what are the co-benefits? And then so that they were a few add-on comments. And just quickly then, natural capital, biodiversity. This is a big area of focus for us. As KPMG, we're one of the founding members of the new initiative to develop the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We have a publication out this week on the importance of the blue economy, where I'm one of the co-authors. So this is a big area of focus for us. You know, it's really clear that we cannot tackle the climate crisis without tackling biodiversity loss. Recent studies have indicated that natural capital, biodiversity loss is also, you know, a global severe threat, an existential threat to humanity. Many interconnections between these two. Studies have indicated that to achieve the Paris climate goals, around 40% of the solutions that we need are based on nature-based solutions. But at the moment, those are natural assets, be they forests, mangroves, our soils and oceans, they're being heavily compromised through our current unsustainable practices and through, you know, continued global warming. You know, we're starting to convert some of those carbon sinks into carbon sources. So essential then that we preserve what we still have, and healthy ecosystems can contribute very significantly to tackling climate change. Studies have indicated that at present, around 40% of our annual emissions are being absorbed by our natural assets, the forests, the oceans, the soils. So nature's doing a great deal of the job for us, and doing it essentially for free. And, you know, despite our sort of technological wizardry, up until this point, our ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere has been negligible. So yes, there are these nascent technologies that are very interesting and that will be incredibly important going forward. But up until this point, the natural world has been doing a deal of the work for us, absorbing, as I said, removing around 40% of our emissions on an annual basis, as well as providing us with a myriad of other ecosystem services, pollination, water purification, improving our spiritual sort of well-being, our mental well-being, our physical well-being, helping to sort of protect us against flood prevention. So a very wide range of benefits. So I think the key message is we cannot tackle the climate crisis without also focusing on protecting our ecosystems. We must remember that you know, our economy, our civilization is a part of, this is a key message from the recent, you know, seminal Dasgupta review, that you know, our economy is embedded within the natural world. Without the natural world, you know, there would be no economy. And obviously economy, ecology, it's no coincidence they have a shared root. So that's, you know, we cannot tackle the climate crisis without also having a major focus on preserving our natural assets.
Yeah, Richard,
so Kubra,
yes.
Kubra, that brings me now first back to where you started, the first point. But before I go to that point, I just wanted to share that, you know, we have these Asia Sustainability Reporting Awards. So we already have 6 editions. So 5 years ago, we introduced 2 new categories. One was the SDGs, you know, and best SDG reporting and best carbon disclosure. So in the first year, second year, first couple of years, there were hardly companies sending entries because they didn't have that kind of disclosures. And those who came, their disclosure level was very poor. But we have seen a marked increase in the number of companies, number of reports entering these two categories, and at the same time, a dramatic improvement in the quality of their disclosure. So I think what I'm seeing on the ground is that more and more companies, and I think thanks to Sustainable Stock Exchange initiative and all their member exchanges legislating reporting and encouraging companies like in Taiwan, Thailand, and Singapore, we have great examples. So what has happened that companies have really started their journey. So for businesses, it's very important that they start their journey, and we are seeing a marked improvement in the quality. Now, the second point that I want to say that you started with a purpose, and then we started discussing SDGs. And I made this point earlier that, businesses, they need to repurpose. Companies, they need to repurpose. And SDGs provide the best template, because once a CEO says that, okay, I like the idea, so we need to be purpose-driven. So what's next? What do we do now? Right. So I think, yes, I think, a business had just to look at these 17 goals, and that's what the world needs. That's what the planet needs. And we will have a very bleak future if these goals are not significantly met by 2030. And businesses will also not gain from that if business will be the biggest losers if these goals are not met. So I think I see another connection there. We are talking about connection and connectivity. So SDGs provide a basis for redesigning, rethinking purpose, corporate purpose, and also provide a great tool, great roadmap for companies to really work on their purpose.
Yes, well, those are very nice, insightful comments. And also, I wanted to mention to Richard that I do appreciate that KPMG is now also looking into biodiversity issues as strongly as they do, as most organizations do on climate change. And people are really realizing more and more biodiversity is a huge issue as well. And especially on that green bonds, for example, everybody is very well aware, and the term by itself is extremely hyped and popular. However, we still now are hearing the term blue bonds. So, definitely, I mean, all of the SDGs are important. The biodiversity may have been, especially oceans, may have been a little bit more in the background, and it's kind of good to hear also that it's coming now also to the forefront. Now, Tiffany, would you like to also share a little bit of United Nations perspective from here, from sustainable tech?
Kubra. I might just pick up on what you were just discussing with the green bonds, because I think we can all recognize that there's been a significant growth in labeled green bonds lately. I think it was in December of 2020 that the Climate Bonds Initiative announced reaching $1 trillion cumulatively in green bonds. And you see the ones being listed now and you think, oh, that's a small number, actually 1 trillion, because these bonds are just increasing in size. But with that in mind, I think I've been noticing from our perspective something different happening since COVID hit. We had a recent webinar with the London Stock Exchange Group and some other stock exchanges on climate related disclosure. And they noted that this year, the London Stock Exchange Group had only social bonds listed. Okay. No green bonds. And another exchange that we work with, a much smaller exchange, had a similar anecdote where they noted that a green bond that was put together by an organization prior to COVID, they decided to shift it. And initially they were looking at changing it to a social bond. And in the end, they landed on labeling it a sustainability bond. So I think this tells us two pretty important things. First, that labeling is not all encompassing. Often when a bond qualifies as green, it also has societal impact, as everybody, I think, has very nicely noted all the links between all the SDGs. Or maybe, as you note, Kubra, it could have been a blue bond, depending on what the projects were. And this fairly quick shift from green bonds to social bonds. I mean, they weren't changing the projects, they were just changing the labeling. Shows us that the projects could have always been labeled one way or the other. So I think more importantly, this shows us that these issues are all totally interlinked, and even despite designing their bonds to suit green, they're able to change it to different labeling. So I think that comes back to what Richard was talking about, and how when we're reporting, we need to make sure it's not at just a top level. It needs to come down into the strategy of the organization. And I'm glad that you brought an update of the TNFD. I think we've learned a lot from the TCFD prior to this with climate-related financial disclosures, which really highlighted how we need to integrate this into our financial disclosures. This isn't separate from finance. These are the same things we're talking about. We've just not included them always in our financial disclosures. So we need to rethink the way we're reporting. And I think when we're pulling it into our reporting through our finance, that's when it really has to pull into our strategy and in our management governance structures. So I think things like TNFD and TCFD are doing really important work on that front. And then maybe I'll just add one more comment on the SDGs. Prior to the 17 SDGs, there were the Millennial Development Goals, the MDGs, which I think people knew much less. I think we did a much better job marketing the SDGs than we did the MDGs. But note that there weren't so many. So we've gone from 8 MDGs to 17 SDGs, and they're the same topics. We've just divided them in a different way to make them in kind of easier to grasp chunks. So I think that shows a lot as to how they are and always have been interconnected. And while at the beginning, we saw a lot of really surface level adoption of the SDGs, those little squares that Rajesh was showing us show up on corporate reports all the time now. Maybe it is needed just as a start to recognize our relation to these impacts. But now we have to go further. And as Richard said, we have to now integrate this more into a holistic thinking within the corporation and understand how this will benefit the opportunities we're going to get as corporations, but also the real systemic risks that are facing us as organizations.
Kubra, could I just add on a bit to Tiffany's? I think definitely agree with Tiffany's comments. I think one of the major challenges for SDG for business is not written in business speak. So it's difficult for businesses to actually correlate to many of the indicators and target levels. So this is what we realized at UNGC as well. Therefore, last year we developed something called the SDG Ambition Benchmarks. So we are looking at SDG from a performance perspective, right? At the end of the day, for a business, what is the performance that's required for a business to positively contribute to sustainable development? So we've identified 10 actions as a starting point, which private sector can now say, immediately, this is how I can relate to SDGs and how this is going to impact my business. So for example, as Rajesh was mentioning, living wage across your organization, equal gender representation across all levels of the organization, zero waste to landfills. So we've identified certain benchmark which is written in business speak and is easily understood by business decision makers. And I also wanted to just bring up something which is my personal opinion. The current approach where businesses are given the flexibility to develop their own maturity matrix, I feel it's going to lead us down the same path of profiteering only, because businesses are going to cherry pick things that, yeah, I know I'm not good at this, I'm not going to pick it, so it's not going to be an important thing for me, right? So I think picking up Richard's point that SDGs can be a strategic agenda, we also need to predetermine certain things that private sector needs to do, right? Because in many of the developing economies, if you look at business strategy, only a handful have related climate risk as part of a core risk that they got to address, right? And everybody's still figuring out what does climate risk mean to me. Now, the other thing that I think needs to take into consideration is there is a clear divide between developing economies and developed economies. I think we cannot hide that fact, right? So while it's good that developed economies are pushing certain standards, it's great that you're pushing living wage across the supply chain, but we have to be careful that the cost is not transferred down and the poor guy at the bottom of the supply chain picks up all the costs. And this is something that we have learned quite painfully from the palm oil sector, right? So you get pushback from certain parts of the geographic equation, say that, look, at the end of the day, it's unfair to us. There's demand, we do it, but nobody wants to pay, right? So it's important to also put money where the action needs to happen. So I think that's the kind of balancing that needs to be looked at for interconnectedness of SDGs as well.
Great. That's great. And if I could just quickly respond to that, because I think Farah's made some really good points there. So just on sort of the cherry picking point, well, I think, so one thing that we've been heavily involved with at KPMG over the last year is, you know, working with the World Economic Forum and the other big four, and we developed the World Economic Forum stakeholder metrics white paper, where we sort of listed the core minimum, if you like, of indicators that all companies should report on, a group of about 20 indicators that, irrespective of what a company does, their sector, their location, they should be relevant to all businesses. To try and standardize it a bit more, because yes, clearly there has been an issue whereby companies have followed different standards, have taken different approaches, have set boundaries at different points, and this has had big issues in some cases around, you know, being able to then benchmark, compare, understand what companies have reported because of all these different approaches. So that's something that we did to try and sort of help standardize it a bit. But I think there's only so far that business can go. Really, what we need is for this to be sort of mandated, for, you know, there to be sort of, you know, legislation which is going to mandate companies to report on particular areas in a particular way. Because until and unless we get to that point, you know, we will continue to see companies deciding to report or not to report, or deciding to follow certain standards or not to follow certain standards, or interpreting a standard in one way or another way. So until we get the moving to being mandatory, we're going to be faced with these challenges. And I guess it also shows how, in dealing with systemic issues like climate change, these other ESG issues, we need a systemic response. And in isolation, no one actor, be they business, be they government, be they you know, the general public, can sort of solve the issue. We all need to work together here.
That's wonderful. Well, Richard and Tiffany and Rajesh and Faroz, I really appreciate that you all have been here and shared all these insights, and also especially very original it is when you can share views from your perspective and from your companies or organizations, because that's not something that we get unless we actually speak to somebody there. So this was a great panel. I again want to thank you to everyone for being here, and to our listeners for being here also and to listen to us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kubra.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Bye.